I never expected her words to change everything, but the night she looked at me and whispered, "If you walk away now, you'll always regret it," I realized some choices can't be undone. I've always thought of her as my friend's mom. That was the role she played in my life for years, familiar, steady, someone who always made sure we had snacks in the fridge and a safe place to be ourselves. She carried herself with a kind of quiet grace that never demanded attention, but somehow always held it. But something shifted in me the older I got. It wasn't one sudden realization, more like a series of small moments I kept brushing off, until one day, I couldn't anymore. That evening I had come by their house to drop off some things for my friend. He wasn't home yet, so she let me in. The house was dim, the last traces of daylight stretching through the kitchen window. She was rinsing a glass at the sink, the water running clear and steady, while the soft, golden light of sunset traced along her hair. It was such a simple image, yet I remember standing there, frozen, struck by how beautiful it was. When she turned to me, smiling in that gentle way she always did, I felt something I hadn't let myself notice before, that her smile reached her eyes, softening them in a way that made me feel seen. "Sit down," she said, drying her hands on a towel. "I'll make you some tea while you wait." I tried to play it casual, but as I sat at the kitchen table, I couldn't help watching the way she moved, not hurried, not careless, but with a quiet ease, like she'd learned to find patience in the smallest of tasks. There was a calmness about her that made everything else feel slower, gentler. When she set the cup in front of me, her fingers brushed mine for just a second. It was nothing, really. A normal gesture. But that fleeting contact stayed with me longer than it should have. Her hand was warm, her touch light, and when she pulled away, I almost wished she hadn't. We sat there, the sound of rain beginning to tap lightly against the windows, filling the silence between us. She asked about my studies, about how life had been lately. And though her questions were ordinary, her attention wasn't. She looked at me directly, listening with a kind of focus that felt rare, like every word I said mattered. I remember thinking that most people my age never listened like that, never created space for me to really speak. But she did. And in that moment, something changed quietly inside me. It wasn't infatuation, not yet. It was a realization that she wasn't just my friend's mom. She was a woman with stories etched into her voice, with kindness woven into her every gesture, with a presence that somehow steadied me. I didn't know then where it would lead. I only knew that when I left that night, I carried the sound of her voice, the warmth of her smile, and the faint memory of her hand brushing mine. And that memory lingered far longer than it should have. It was supposed to be a quick visit. That's how it always started, dropping something off, stopping by when my friend wasn't around, filling the silence until he came home. But somehow, our conversations began to stretch longer, as though either of us was in a hurry to move on. One evening, it was raining harder than usual. The house was quiet except for the steady patter of water against the windows. She poured us both a cup of chamomile tea, the steam curling between us as she sat across the table. Her sleeves were rolled just above her elbows, and her hair was pulled back loosely, a few strands falling to frame her face. At first, we spoke about the usual things: my classes, work, the small frustrations of everyday life. But gradually, she leaned in, resting her chin lightly on her hand, and her questions changed. They weren't just polite curiosities anymore. She asked me how I really felt about where I was headed. Whether I was happy. Whether I was afraid of making the wrong choices. It caught me off guard, the way she asked those questions. Most people tossed them out casually, barely waiting for an answer. But with her, it was different. She listened, really listened, as though every word I gave her deserved space. I admitted more than I expected. How restless I felt, how often I questioned myself. She didn't laugh, didn't dismiss it as youth or inexperience. Instead, she nodded slowly, her eyes holding mine with quiet understanding. "You know," she said softly, her voice carrying a kind of tired wisdom, "when I was your age, I thought I had forever to figure things out. I thought mistakes didn't matter because there would always be time to fix them. But time, it moves faster than you expect. Her words hung in the air, carried by the sound of rain and the faint clink of her spoon stirring the tea. There was something in her tone, something that hinted at a story she didn't fully share. I asked if she ever regretted anything. For a moment, her gaze shifted to the window, following the rivulets of water streaming down the glass. Regret? She gave a faint, almost sad smile. We all have some. The question is whether you learn to live with them, or let them live with you. Silence followed, not awkward but heavy, meaningful. I realized she wasn't just answering me, she was revealing a part of herself, letting me see a vulnerability she rarely showed. Her laugh broke the weight of it, quiet and self-deprecating, as if to brush it all away. But I noticed the way her fingers curled around her cup, holding it a little tighter than before. And for the first time, I saw her not just as someone older, wiser, untouchable, but as a woman who carried her own doubts, her own aches, her own fragile hopes. That night, as I left, I caught myself thinking about her words over and over. She wasn't just a figure from my childhood anymore. Somehow, she was becoming the person I trusted most, the one who heard me in ways no one else did. It was a Saturday afternoon when it happened. My friend had gone out for the day, but I stopped by to return something I borrowed. She answered the door, surprised but smiling, and invited me in. The house smelled faintly of fresh coffee and something sweet cooling on the counter. We ended up in the living room, the rain from the night before replaced by a soft, golden sunlight pouring through the curtains. She was sorting through a stack of books on the coffee table, deciding which to keep and which to give away. I sat down beside her to help. It felt natural, until our hands reached for the same book. Her fingers touched mine, just lightly, but neither of us pulled away at first. Her skin was warm, soft, her nails faintly grazing as she hesitated. My heart gave a quiet jolt, and when I glanced at her, I found her already looking at me. It wasn't a long look, maybe a second, maybe two. But it carried something I couldn't name. She smiled faintly, almost apologetically, and then let go of the book. I picked it up, pretending to study the cover. But the truth was my mind had frozen on that small moment, that accidental brush of her hand. Later, when she leaned forward to reach for another stack, a strand of her hair slipped loose. Without thinking, I reached out and gently brushed it back from her face. My fingertips barely grazed her temple, but she stilled at the touch. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice softer than usual. I nodded quickly, trying to steady my breathing, but the air between us had shifted. Every movement, every glance, felt charged, fragile, like one wrong word could shatter it. We carried on with the books, but the silence was different now, not empty, but filled with the awareness of each other. Every time her sleeve brushed against mine, I felt it like a spark. Every time she laughed softly at something I said, I caught myself staring too long at the curve of her smile. When she finally stood to bring the books to a box by the door, I rose too. She brushed something from my shoulder, just a speck of dust, but her hand lingered, fingertips pressing lightly against the fabric as her eyes met mine again. For a moment, it felt as though the room held its breath. The sunlight, the quiet, the closeness, all of it seemed to draw us together. But then she pulled her hand back, almost too quickly, and turned away with a small, nervous laugh. I didn't push it. I didn't dare. But that night, lying awake, I kept feeling the ghost of her touch, on my hand, my shoulder, my temple. And I knew, deep down, that neither of us could pretend it meant nothing. The days that followed felt different, though nothing between us had been said outright. We carried on with the same politeness, the same casual conversations, but beneath it all there was an undercurrent neither of us could ignore. One evening, I stopped by later than usual. The sky had already darkened, and the house was quiet except for the faint crackle of a fire in the living room. She was sitting on the couch, her legs tucked beneath her, a book resting loosely in her hand. The glow from the fireplace lit her features in warm tones, deepening the shadows around her eyes, softening everything else. She looked up when I walked in, and for a moment, it felt like the world slowed. "Your timing is good," she said with a small smile. "I was just about to make tea." But instead of getting up, she motioned for me to sit. I did, lowering myself onto the other end of the couch. The heat of the fire, the quiet of the room, and the fact that it was just the two of us, it made the air feel heavier, almost fragile. We spoke at first about ordinary things. But slowly, as the minutes passed, her words drifted to more personal territory. "Do you ever feel like life is slipping past too quickly?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the flames. "Like you're running to catch up with it, and no matter how hard you try, you're always a step behind?" I hesitated before answering, but the truth came easier with her than it ever did with anyone else. "All the time. I think about where I'm supposed to be, and it feels like I don't belong anywhere. Like everyone expects me to be someone I'm not." Her eyes shifted to mine, and there was a softness in them, a kind of recognition. She set her book aside, folding her hands in her lap. "I understand that more than you think," she murmured. "It doesn't really stop when you get older. The questions just change." Her voice was low, steady, but there was something in it that carried weight, something unspoken. I wanted to ask what she meant, what she was holding back. But instead, I just sat there, watching the way the firelight flickered across her face. At some point, the space between us closed. She leaned a little closer, maybe without realizing it, and I felt the warmth of her presence. Her shoulder almost brushed mine, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off her skin. And then the conflict pressed in, sharp and undeniable. She was my friend's mother. Older, wiser, standing on the other side of a line I wasn't supposed to cross. And yet, in that quiet moment, none of it mattered, not the years, not the boundaries. All I wanted was to stay there, caught in the silence that seemed to belong only to us. She turned her face slightly, catching my gaze again, and for a long second neither of us looked away. The fire crackled softly, and I could hear my own heartbeat louder than anything else. But just when it felt like something might break between us, she shifted back, clearing her throat gently as if to remind herself, and me, of where we stood. I smiled faintly, pretending it was nothing, though we both knew better. The tension hung there, quiet but insistent, as though daring us to acknowledge what neither of us was ready to say aloud. It happened on a night I didn't plan to stay long. I had dropped by after a late class, intending only to hand her a small package my friend had forgotten. But the moment she opened the door, I could tell she'd been sitting alone for hours, the soft glow of a single lamp behind her, the quiet hum of the television in the background, the faint weariness in her smile. "Come in," she said gently, stepping aside. "You shouldn't be driving around so late anyway." I followed her inside, the house unusually silent. My friend wasn't home, and it was just the two of us again. She poured me a glass of water, and we ended up in the living room, speaking in hushed voices as though the stillness of the house demanded it. We talked longer than I expected. About little things at first, then heavier ones. She told me about the kind of loneliness that doesn't go away just because you fill a room with people. I told her about the constant pull I felt between expectation and desire, about wanting to be true to myself but not knowing how. The more she spoke, the more I realized how much I wanted to protect her, not because she was fragile, but because she carried so much weight behind her calm exterior. And the more I spoke, the more I felt she saw me, not as someone young or uncertain, but as a man finding his way. But eventually, the night grew heavy, and the clock reminded me that I couldn't stay forever. I stood near the doorway, keys in hand, while she lingered a few steps away, her figure framed in the amber lamplight. "I should go," I said quietly, though my voice felt unsteady. She didn't move at first. Her hands were clasped lightly in front of her, her eyes fixed on mine with a softness that pulled me in. For a heartbeat, I thought she might let me leave without a word. But then she stepped forward, just enough to close the space between us. Her hand reached out, not forcefully but with quiet certainty, and rested lightly against my wrist. The warmth of her touch stopped me in place. I turned, meeting her gaze, and there was something in it I had never seen so openly before: vulnerability, longing, and a kind of bravery that startled me. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through me like nothing else ever had. "If you walk away now," she said, her breath catching slightly, You'll always regret it. The silence that followed was thick, suspended, like the whole house was holding its breath with us. My heart pounded in my chest, my throat tight with words I didn't know how to say. In that instant, every unspoken thought, every fleeting touch, every lingering glance between us suddenly made sense. She wasn't just warning me. She was inviting me to choose, to stop running from what had been building all along. I stood there, frozen, knowing that if I left, nothing would ever be the same. And if I stayed, nothing would ever be the same either. Her words hung in the air, soft but unshakable, and I felt them echo through me like a bell that refused to stop ringing. If you walk away now, you'll always regret it. I didn't move at first. My hand still rested on the doorknob, the cold metal under my fingers, while the warmth of her touch lingered on my wrist. The world seemed to hold still, the lamp's quiet hum, the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway, even the sound of my own breath. It was as though time itself had paused, waiting for my choice. I let go of the door. Slowly, I turned back toward her. She hadn't dropped her gaze, though I could see the faint uncertainty flickering in her eyes. She looked brave and vulnerable all at once, like someone standing on the edge of something she both feared and wanted. Without thinking, I stepped closer. The space between us shrank until I could feel the warmth radiating from her. She lifted her hand from my wrist to my chest, her palm resting lightly against me. The contact was almost tentative, but I knew she could feel how fast my heart was racing beneath her touch. I don't want to hurt you, I whispered. The words slipped out before I could stop them, raw and uncertain. Her eyes softened, and her fingers curled gently against my shirt. You couldn't, she said quietly. Not by being honest. I don't remember making the decision, only the sensation of it, my arms lifting, hesitant at first, then steady, as they drew her closer. She came willingly, her body fitting against mine with a sigh that seemed to release something she'd been holding for too long. Her cheek rested against my chest, and I felt the faint, steady rhythm of her heartbeat against me. My chin brushed her hair, and the scent of her, warm, familiar, faintly floral, filled my senses. I held her gently, afraid that if I squeezed too tightly, I might break the spell. For a long while, we didn't speak. We simply stood there, wrapped in the silence, letting it wash over us. My hand settled at her back, hers resting against my chest, and the room itself seemed to fold around us, the lamplight, the quiet, the fragile peace. When she finally pulled back just enough to look up at me, her eyes searched mine. There was no rush, no desperation. Only a quiet question that lingered between us. I answered it not with words but with the way I held her gaze, steady and certain. Her hand lifted to my face, her fingertips brushing along my jaw. The touch was so tender, so deliberate, that it sent a shiver through me. I leaned slightly into her palm, and she smiled, a small, trembling smile that seemed to carry both relief and wonder. We didn't need to say anything else. The closeness, the shared breath, the way our hands found each other and stayed, it was enough. We weren't rushing forward, we were simply allowing ourselves to be where we already were. The morning came quietly, as though the world itself was reluctant to disturb us. Pale sunlight streamed through the curtains, spilling a soft glow across the kitchen. I sat at the table, a steaming cup of coffee between my hands, while she moved around the room with a kind of unhurried calm. There was no rush, no need to fill the silence. The night before still lingered between us, not as something fragile, but as something tender, carefully unfolding. She set her own cup down and took the chair beside me. Not across the table, not at a distance, beside me. Her hand brushed mine on the surface, fingers lightly curling until they rested together, open, natural, unhidden. I glanced at her, half expecting her to look away. But she didn't. Her eyes met mine with quiet steadiness, the kind of gaze that didn't demand answers, only trust. You stay, she said softly, as if she still needed to hear it aloud. I couldn't leave, I replied, my voice low but certain. She smiled faintly, her thumb tracing the back of my hand in a small, thoughtful rhythm. For a moment I saw something shift in her expression, a release, as though she was allowing herself to believe that what happened between us wasn't a mistake, wasn't a fleeting lapse, but something real. I keep thinking about what people would say, she admitted after a pause, her tone more contemplative than fearful. How it might look. The difference in years, the roles we're supposed to stay in. Her honesty settled over us, gentle but heavy. I squeezed her hand, grounding us both. I've thought about that too, I admitted. But when I'm with you, it doesn't feel like a question of age or roles. It feels like… I hesitated, searching for the right word. Home. Her breath caught just slightly, her lips parting as though she wanted to respond but couldn't find the words. Instead, she leaned closer, resting her forehead lightly against mine. The warmth of her skin, the closeness of her breath, it was answer enough. We sat like that for a while, two people simply existing together in the soft light of morning. There was no grand declaration, no desperate promise. Just the simple truth that neither of us wanted to let go. Eventually she straightened, her hands still entwined with mine, and laughed quietly, not nervously this time, but with a kind of quiet joy. I don't know what comes next, she admitted. But I know I don't want to pretend anymore. I smiled, feeling the weight in my chest finally ease. Then we won't. The clock ticked in the background, the world outside moving on as though nothing had changed. But for us, everything had. We sat together, our coffee cooling between us, her hand resting firmly in mine. No longer hesitant, no longer hidden. Just two people choosing, in that moment, to be exactly where they were meant to be.